Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Town meeting of the LaRouche Organization for Saturday, August 6th. We've entitled today's meeting, not Nancy Pelosi, but rather Benjamin Franklin and the FDR Presidency. And we, of course, will be speaking today about the infamous kamikaze visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. But before we get to that, we need to update everybody on the continually breaking story with regard to the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation's attempts to label and libel the Schiller Institute and many other institutions and individuals as information terrorists. Now, what happened was that on July 14th, representatives of the Ukrainian government issued a blacklist, originally including, could you show the first graphic, please? Issued a blacklist, originally including 78 names and then later 72 names. Next, including 30 participants in previous conferences held by the Schiller Institute. These conferences had names such as "There Can Be No Peace Without the Bankruptcy Reorganization of the Dying Transatlantic Financial System," and other such names. The importance of this is that the purpose of the conferences was to propose a system for peace and negotiation, both in Ukraine and in other international theaters of war, by the creation of a new security and development architecture. What happened was that Andrei Sokolov, who was the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation, said information terrorists should know that they will have to answer to the law as war criminals. And that was the way that he characterized the conferences of the Schiller Institute and the persons that had been involved and participated in those conferences. Now, there was a response to this from the Schiller Institute, which was called for an investigation of the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation list. That response stated in part, "In times of war, publishing such a list is tantamount to targeting individuals. It is all the more unacceptable that the list agglomerates the names of many speakers representing top institutions from around the globe with diverse opinions who are involved in a dialogue searching to arrive at peace in the interest of all. To assume that such a wide array of speakers are all Putin agents and can't think for themselves can only be explained by a belief in conspiracy theories or as mere vulgar propaganda, or both. The key question is whether the listed speakers are promoting viewpoints consonant with the truth." And the full statement is available on the Schiller Institute website. In addition, one of the individuals that had been also blacklisted and denounced was Scott Ritter, well known to those who followed his career as a whistleblower around the first Iraq War and also his recent work on Ukraine. Mr. Ritter wrote an article called "Chuck Schumer's War on Free Speech," subtitled "The Senate Majority Leader, Schumer, pushed through a funding bill that now supports a structure under which U.S. citizens and politicians, including a challenger for his own seat, are being targeted as information terrorists." Now, the particular challenger being referred to here is Diane Sare, and Mr. Ritter devoted the second half of his article to talking about Diane Sare, the fact that she had qualified to run for Senate in the state of New York as an independent, and that she was one of the people listed on the Ukraine list. Ritter asked the question whether or not any congressional or Senate body has the right to finance foreign bodies, which in turn threaten both the reputations and the lives of American citizens, deeming them terrorists. Now, there's a deeper story, however, to what and why what is happening and why it's happening around the Schiller Institute. This morning, actually, an article appeared in an Indian newspaper by the name of The Hindu, respected newspaper going back to the early 19th century, actually, and in its founding. And it was called Schiller Institute Calls for New Bretton Woods to End War and Economic Crisis. And this article actually had a section, which I'll just reference here, the global think tank, the Schiller Institute, that recently hit the headlines for organizing an international conference on the Ukraine war and the economic crisis, was shaped by the ideas of the late American economist Lyndon LaRouche, who witnessed the communal carnage in 1946 in Calcutta, and Mrs. Helga Zepp LaRouche, who started the Institute in 1984. In a telephone interview with the Hindu, Mrs. LaRouche said her late husband served as an American soldier in the China, India, Myanmar theater during the World War II, and that his ideas against British imperialism were shaped at that time and through interactions with a long line of Indian leaders that included Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Now, this leads us to the actual central focus on why it is that the Schiller Institute, of all of the persons and institutions listed, was number one. In fact, the first 30 persons on the list all came from those that had been involved in the dialogue that the Schiller Institute had been promulgating. And it's because of this proposal, this ad hoc committee to create a new Bretton Woods, because of the fact that the transatlantic financial system is in great chaos, is bankrupt, cannot be saved, and will have to, in fact, be reorganized. That system is seen by some in the West as being identical to the states of the West. In other words, that if that transatlantic financial system were to collapse, then that would mean that the integrity of the nation states of that area would be irreparably compromised. That is not true. And the American constitutional system in particular provides for, through the United States Department of Treasury and other means through the Congress, the ability of the United States to issue credit to institutions and to, in fact, bankrupt those bankrupt institutions that are separate from the United States government. That's what Franklin Roosevelt was able to do in 1933 upon acceding to the position of President of the United States on March 4th. And over the course of approximately a week, he began the process of a bank holiday, a drying out of the speculative system, and he rallied the American people to then place money back in the banks and restored confidence to the actual American system, which was not the system of Wall Street. This is an important thing to cite here. It's little known, unfortunately, or less well known than it should be known among Americans today. And that's precisely what would have to be done in the United States and in other countries in the transatlantic sector. And it's precisely that which cannot be allowed to be said or exposed to the American people, and because that is the basis of a sane negotiation of international and foreign relations with Russia, China, India, and all other nations. Now we've come to the one of the least savory sideshows of the last week, which was Nancy Pelosi's unfortunate kamikaze visit to Taiwan. Now, international observers noted that during the conclusion of her visit, unwelcome visit, and speech, Pelosi misquoted Benjamin Franklin, who once said, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." Instead, what Pelosi did at the conclusion of her speech, blaming Benjamin Franklin for her formulation, was to recite the standard mafia protection racket advice to Taiwan. And we're going to play for you her actual words and what she attempted to say.
Sources of strength is democracy. I said at a meeting earlier with the parliamentarians, in our earliest days of our founding of our country, Benjamin Franklin, our presidency, said, freedom and democracy. Freedom and democracy on one thing, security here. We can't have either if we don't have both.
That's that is
security, economics, security, economy. And again, they're all, and governance, they're all related. And we want Taiwan to always have freedom with security. And we're not backing away from that. Okay? Thank you.
whoa. Okay, so what the actual quote is: those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
That's what she was going for?
That's the quote. Here's what she said: freedom and democracy, security here. If we don't have, we can't have either. If we don't have both, so security, economic, security, economy, again, they're all, and governance, they're all related.
Now, Lyndon LaRouche, in a document that he wrote back in August of 1983, which is titled A 50-Year Development Policy for the Indian Pacific Oceans Basin, pointed out, it is not uncommon that states should be devoutly committed to foreign policies directly contrary to their own best interests. Now, we thank the Jimmy Dore show for showing and capturing that moment of Pelosi's speech, but actually it's not a laughing matter. She was, in fact, there, and she was there against the wishes of China and perhaps against the advice of various people in the United States government itself. And she did provoke a crisis, and that crisis could even become military, at least in certain of its implications. So it's necessary, we think, as a service to the United States and also in the interest of defending what should be the honor of the United States, to present an alternate view of this concept of freedom and what it actually involves, which was offered by Lyndon LaRouche in December of 1988 in the course of a speech he was giving for a Food for Peace conference at that time. I should also note that this was just literally about a month before Lyndon LaRouche would be incarcerated through the actions of nefarious forces in the United States that wanted to make sure that his bids for the presidency of the United States would never be successful.
There are two kinds of natural law, or two aspects of natural law. One are the laws of the universe, and a man who, or say a Congress were to repeal the law of gravity, just for illustration, would that repeal the law of gravity? It would not. So that whenever men, because they have great political power, say that they are defying what is in effect a law of the physical universe, a law of nature, natural law, and they cause others by their power to support that defiance of nature, what happens to the nations which defy nature? They are crushed, they're destroyed. Their defiance of natural law becomes the instrument of their destruction. If you support politicians who engage in that defiance of natural law, what do you bring upon yourself and your nation? You become an accomplice, you enforce that destruction, you bring about the destruction of your nation, your family, of everything. And there lies upon us then, and how we respond to that challenge, the moral responsibility for the fate of hundreds of billions of souls who, in all propriety, should be born in the time to come. There lies upon us the responsibility of looking back to those martyrs who gave us institutions in which truth was given social standing, and thus freedom. There is no freedom without truth, and there is no truth without freedom. The right of an individual, informed by right principles, to come to an opinion based on reason, not arbitrary opinion, but based on careful employment of reason. And the right of that individual to stand up and say, this is what I believe, unless I am persuaded to the contrary by reason. That is freedom. If the entirety of society disagrees with you, so what? You have the right, as long as you're guided by reason, and as long as you will submit yourself to correction of your opinion by reason. That is the right to assert an opinion contrary to the majority of society around you. That is freedom. A democratic society, as Project Democracy and the Congress divides it today, is the most horrible abomination imaginable, against which the founders of the United States warned. Democracy is the worst of all evils, the worst of all tyrants, because there is no worse tyrant than in the irrational mob, the lynch mob. Democracy, as they define it, is lynch mob democracy. Just don't have the wrong color of skin or the wrong color of opinion, under which the individual has no right but the right to agree with what appears to be majority or ruling opinion. And if the mob changes its opinion, you tear off your clothes and put on the clothes it puts on, and so forth and so on. A society of fads and insanity with no moral purpose, no character, and no ability to reason. The defense of the individual who wishes to reason, who wishes to be governed by natural law and reason, that is the most sacred duty of society, the defense and nurture of such individuals. And a society which does not fulfill that mission is unfit to exist. A form of government which does not serve that purpose is not fit to exist, because it does not protect the most precious part of human society, the development of the powers of reason in the individual. The thing that makes us truly human, the thing that makes our lives, individual lives, each sacred. And that's what is at stake. We have each an individual responsibility if we wish to be free. Martyrs who understood the principle which I've just stated, many of them fought over generations, often seemingly without hope of victory, to bring into being those conditions which the founders of our republic, in the Declaration of Independence and as expressed in the Federal Constitution, especially the preamble, to bring about the condition of society which corresponded to the principles of truth and freedom. How many gave their lives for that purpose? How many gave us every gift of knowledge on which we depend, which we stand? And we look back, and if we betrayed the past, we betrayed that trust that they gave to us. And if we also look to the future and say to the hundreds of millions of souls waiting to be, billions of souls waiting to be born, we betrayed you too. What are we? We are as nothing.
Now imagine if that speech had been given by Lyndon LaRouche in Beijing or Taiwan. It's about 6 minutes. What would that sentiment, or for that matter, imagine if that speech is given by any representative of the LaRouche organization or of the Schiller Institute at this time? What would that do to change the course of American policy and American relations with those nations of the Pacific? we have to find a way to access the powers of the presidency of the United States and the powers of the citizenry of the United States, the intellectual powers in particular, to cause this change to occur. So to discuss this today, we have with us Bill Jones of the China desk, as we say, of EIR, Executive Intelligence Review. And we have Carl Osgood, who is a researcher and writer for EIR, who puts out the daily item called the War Report. It's always a nice way to start the day if you want to wake up. Or you may want to call back into bed actually after reading it, depending. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna begin with Bill, and then go to Carl, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion subsequent to that. So Bill.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Very happy to be here today. Very difficult time. We have experienced the last week a sea change in world politics. World after Nancy Pelosi's visit is no longer the same as it was before. And we got to try and figure out during the course of this discussion, I hope to give an indication of how that change is going to occur and what position we have to take with regard to that. Nancy Pelosi, I would think it's a little optimistic to call it a kamikaze visit because Nancy Pelosi survived. The question is, will the world survive as a result of that? Nancy Pelosi went in there as I think, a last-minute swan song to a career which will be over sooner or later, probably sooner because of the visit. But at least by November, she will probably be out, and she was probably aware of that fact. And given her career of poking China in the eye during the course of that career, she wanted to do one last attempt at doing this, at creating a chaos for the Chinese government. And it blew up in her face. It blew up in the face of the U.S. government, which had failed to keep her from going on this trip, even though there was a clear indication that when she did this, there would be a strong reaction from the government of China. Now, why was this visit so important? Why was it considered different by the Chinese government than other Congress people who went there? That was because Nancy Pelosi is a member of the United States government. She is in the legislative branch, but a member of the government as a whole. She's the Speaker of the House. And the U.S. had made a commitment that they do not recognize Taiwan as an independent nation, and that therefore official exchanges of any high-level officials will not occur. Let me just go back and give you an indication of why Taiwan is so important to the Chinese people. First of all, for 1,400 years, it has been a part of China in its various forms. It was separated from China in 1895 when the Japanese defeated the Chinese in the first Sino-Japanese War. They took Taiwan and a number of other places from China and held them until 1945. In 1945, the Japanese were defeated by a combination of the Allied forces, which included the government of the Republic of China, and that therefore, after the war, all of those possessions had been taken by the Japanese in either of their Sino-Japanese wars, the one in 1895 or the one in 1937, would be given back to China. And this was generally recognized and confirmed by the United States government. What had happened within China, of course, is that the failure of the United States trying to get, as Roosevelt wanted, some coalition between the ruling government of Chiang Kai-shek and the Communist Party, which differed very much in their views on a lot of issues, including the issues of land reform, which had been on the plate of Sun Yat-sen when he organized the Kuomintang, but had been lost in the shuffle when Chiang Kai-shek took over and created an alliance with the landowners who didn't want a land reform. Communist Party wanted this reform, and so they were on different tacks, but they did unite in the war with the help of the United States to fight the Japanese. As it ended, there was a year-long attempt by George Marshall to bring the parties together, but Chiang Kai-shek was not interested in sharing power with the Communist Party of China, and therefore these talks failed. You had a civil war. The Chinese, the forces of the Communist Party won that war. They did it not so much by the fact of their military power, but by the fact that they had won the hearts and minds of the people by their policy toward the Chinese people during the course of that Second War. There's force Chiang Kai-shek, which had, fortunately, supported by the United States. The U.S. didn't send troops there. They didn't want another war after World War II, but they were giving the logistical support to the Chiang government. And when he fled to the island of Taiwan, which is about 130 kilometers off the coast of China, they gave them they gave support to him. The Chinese, a Chinese Communist Party, which had won the war, could have invaded Taiwan and would have won back Taiwan as a part of China, except for the fact, A, that they had no navy to speak of, and B, that the United States was continuing to support Chiang Kai-shek on the island, which they did by naming it the official representative, as it had been before the Civil War, of the people of China. As a result of that, they also received the seat in the newly formed United Nations, which was designated to China, which was one of the more important members of the Security Council. And that's the situation you had until 1972, with the visit of Nixon, went to China. A population of over 500 million people at that time could not be ignored. There was an attempt to try and use it to also help to bring conclusion to the Vietnam War, the influence of China on that issue. And therefore, it was in the cards that this reunification had to take place. John Kennedy even wanted to do it, but he couldn't do it until his second term, and he didn't get a second term, as we all know. So it was delayed, but it was inevitable. You cannot ignore a nation of this size in the Pacific, even though at that time it was very poor. It could not be ignored. The basis for that reunification was on the issue, especially of Taiwan. The United States had recognized Taiwan as the government of China, but in 1971, with the influx of dozens of developing countries into the United Nations, they were also quite clear that there was something wrong with this, that the nation of 500 million people was not recognized in its lawful seat, and therefore they made a vote to change that. In the course of that, 181 countries, I think it was in total, came to an agreement to recognize the People's Republic of China as the representatives of the Chinese people. And all of those had also recognized the fact that there was only one China. There was not one China on mainland and one China on the island of Taiwan. It was not one China and one Taiwan. There was one China, and that Taiwan was a part of China. That was also accepted in the UN resolution in the course of this shift in the United Nations, that they also accepted that one China policy. So that when the United States was supposed to establish a relationship with them, they also had to make that agreement. And it was done in the form of what were called 3 communiques. I have a copy of the 3 communiques here. One that was in 1972, which is the longer of the 3, which was signed during Nixon's visit, where the first commitment was made that the United States would no longer recognize Taiwan as the representative of China, nor would it recognize that as the government of anything, and would accept the fact that Taiwan was a part of China. They also made the commitment that they would not do anything to try and support an independence for the island of Taiwan. This was in the second communique, which was when the United States in 1979, several years after the first visit of Nixon, became official relations were established during the Carter period with the People's Republic of China. There was another communique, which was shorter, but reiterated the fact very clearly that the United States does not adheres to one China policy, does not accept two Chinas, and does not accept one China and one Taiwan. Third communique was made later on during the Reagan years, where they said that that they would stop sending weapons to Taiwan. First, they would draw down on the amount of weapons that were being sent to Taiwan, and eventually they would set a date where no more weapons would be sent to Taiwan in accordance with these earlier agreements. That has largely been abrogated by the U.S. Congress in the Taiwan Relations Act, where they made a commitment that we would send only weapons to Taiwan that we feel is necessary for them to defend themselves. That also was more or less an abrogation of part of that, but the Chinese have protested that, but it was not a deal breaker. Nevertheless, what Pelosi did was a deal breaker. First of all, she was warned. The Chinese warned privately that given the generally low state of relationships between China and the United States, as everybody's aware of over the past two administrations, things were this was a situation in which any kind of blow up could lead to more serious consequences than if the relationship were in much better shape. But this was essentially a visit that was treated by the Taiwanese and by the Pelosi delegation as a semi-official visit, that with the full protocol of an official visit. The Chinese had warned privately to the United States that this is not a good idea. It would have serious repercussions. Then didn't get much of a response. You had this phone call between Biden and President Xi, where he assured President Xi that yes, we do support one China, and that we do not support Taiwanese independence. Nevertheless, the visit continued to move on in that direction. The Pentagon had meetings with Pelosi, explained to her the danger that might occur because of this. The White House, according to reports, made a lot of private discussions with her to discourage her from going, and she decided that she would want to go. I would compare it not so much the kamikaze visit because she survived this, but to Louis XV, who, as the masses were outside the door, demanding entry into the palace, he says, "After me, the deluge." And that Pelosi's attitude was that first I'll do this, and then whatever happens, the world will have to suffer. And the Chinese reaction was extremely, extremely tough. Some people thought, oh, well, maybe they'll invade Taiwan. They wouldn't do that. They probably don't want to do that, except under very extreme conditions. But they did want to make a very clear point that this was a deal breaker. So what they did is that they mobilized all of their forces, not only the Eastern Theater, which is responsible for Taiwan, but the rocket forces, many of the other theater forces that were in existence. At the point that Pelosi's plane landed in Taiwan, these things began. Su-35s took off from China over the mainland, over this dividing line in the sea between Taiwan and China, and ships were deployed in 6 different places all around the island of Taiwan. It was surrounded, and they announced as they were doing this that in 3 days' time, or 2 days' time, they would begin live fire operations in these strategic areas. So Thursday, these things began. There were firings. Carl, I'm sure, has maps of these things. There were deployments on the eastern side of Taiwan, that is in the Pacific Ocean, in the Taiwan Straits, in the north of Taiwan, in the south of Taiwan, covering all of the ports of Taiwan. During the course of these live fire operations, ships are not going to be going into Taiwan, so that trade is largely stopped until these maneuvers finish, and they will finish tonight at 12 o'clock. And the Chinese have said that, and that's what they will do. But during the point of time they were ongoing, it is really blockaded to a large extent. Everything going in, coming out of Taiwan, because they're going through areas where there are drills, live fire drills going on. They also did what they had never done before. Well, first of all, they never surrounded the entire island before. They also had firings from the mainland into the eastern part of the sea east of Taiwan, which of course would be, in a war situation, an attempt to destroy any vessels coming in to try and assist Taiwan during the course of a Chinese assault on Taiwan. So what they did, their reaction initially was to show to the world what they can do if they were really serious, and if the situation developed to such a point that they felt that Taiwan independence was going to be declared. This is what they could do and would do. So I think it was an eye-opener, even for those at the Pentagon, who realized that there was going to be a very tough response. Secondly, what they did is economically, they stopped all the extra sand to Taiwan. Sand, of course, is very important for construction. It's also important for the semiconductor industry. Quartz sand is used in creating semiconductors. Taiwan has their own, but the largest part of their import of this is from China. China also ostensibly because of problems in the health issues, stopped the import of fruits, citrus, and fish from Taiwan. Of course, is a very important part of their economy. So that the live firings, just to make a point, also went into the economic, so-called exclusive economic zone of Japan, to also send a signal to them with regard to that. So it was a situation which has created a very serious crisis between the countries. The Chinese have also cut off all military relations, discussions, talks with the United States on a number of areas, on counterterrorism, counter narcotics, climate change. All these discussions are off the table at the present moment. And that in one sense, the ball now is in the U.S. court. The Chinese have also made clear that they're not going to go back to business as usual. So what the Pelosi did is it said to the Chinese that we can no longer simply accept the fact that the United States is saying what we want to hear. They have to take actions which are consistent with the commitments that they're making. And until we see a sign that that is the case, we are not going to go back to nice discussions on any of these issues until the relationship is put back on track by the United States. This was also evident in terms of the meetings that the Chinese foreign minister held with ASEAN. There was an ASEAN foreign ministers. Both the ASEAN countries were there, as the foreign ministers of Japan, the United States, and China. Wang Yi declined to meet with Blinken. He also refused to meet with the Japanese foreign minister. at this meeting. They were there at the meetings together, but they didn't have a bilateral meeting. In one instance, of course, there was a private dinner in which there was a waiting room for the ministers to go into the dinner. And the Japanese foreign minister was there, and Wang Yi walked in there, and not even wanting some kind of discussion of a less formal nature and of reading them, walked out and not go to the dinner. That's how serious the situation is. Now, what reaction in the United States? Well, the United States, of course, is blaming China for outrageous reaction, overreacting to the Pelosi visit, trying to place the blame on China. They called in the U.S. ambassador on Thursday and tried to give him a dressing down, but he was very clear that this is not our problem. We did not cause it. You are the ones who set this thing up, who triggered this reaction, who triggered what we didn't want to do, what we said we would probably do if this visit went through, and so that the onus lies with you. And they had a discussion as far with Kurt Campbell, who's in charge for national security in the Asia Pacific region, and they made very clear to Campbell that was the situation, and that they bore no responsibility for their actions, because their actions was a necessary action to preserve the net territorial sovereignty of the nation of China. Now, their position, of course, and the action of the Japanese, the United States initially didn't issue a statement themselves, but they, through the British, I understand, they got a statement from the G7, where the G7 also said that this is action or unconscionable actions taken by the Chinese, and they should be stopped immediately. And even in that, they said something about, well, we also really, in our own way, accept this one China policy. That didn't fly either. Wang Yi called that a complete farce, and rejected a piece of paper that just should be thrown in the trash can. So, I mean, this is the way they're seeing things until there is some form of action on the United States that would change around. And their position here is very good. There are similarities, of course, to how the U.S. has reacted in the Ukraine crisis, but the two are very much different, as the Chinese will say. But they're the same to the extent that it's the United States has felt that we can determine what we want to do regardless of issues of international law. The one China policy is really part of international law. 181 countries have accepted that. And what you have seen after the Chinese reaction, the U.S. got their usual allies, the Aussies, the Japanese, the G7 issued a statement which was rather, in the same vein under British influence. But if you look at the statements being made by the individual European nations, like Germany, it's more in the sense of we would like to have a peaceful resolution of this situation without this opprobrium against the Chinese. So even in that respect, even among the so-called allies, you have people who really do feel that this was something that the United States bears responsibility for, and not the Chinese. And then, of course, what you also are having is literally dozens of countries which are, again, reiterating the fact that they support the one China policy, including the United Nations. The spokesperson for the United Nations made a similar statement, as did Secretary General Guterres, that this is the policy of the United Nations. So you have China stand on the basis of the rule of law, of international law, that what they are doing has not broken with that, but what the United States has done in moving in the direction of trying to create this independent Taiwan, or pulling Taiwan away from China and using it as a pawn in a game against the People's Republic of China. This now is really clearly not accepted by the world community. And their position, I think, in that is very strong. The other thing I might add, and of course Carl may say something on this too, is that the fundamental issue is the issue of the law, the right of China to claim a territory which has been in their position for 1,400 years, including accepted by the United States in 1945, and then, of course, also in 1972 with the first communique that this is a part of China. But if you look at the map and you put yourself in the head of Chinese senators who see what the United States has done in Ukraine in pushing the border right up to the border of Russia at a point where they could actually launch a military strike, nuclear or otherwise, into Moscow or other critical places in China, and look at Taiwan geographically, which is 130 kilometers at the I think the shortest distance from the it's 81 miles from the coast of China. You will see that if they play the same game there in trying to make Taiwan into a pawn of the United States to the point that it would become a military asset of the United States, then this would be an issue that far more significant and serious than the Cuba crisis, and that was not acceptable. The basic issue is that it is a part of China. It is legally a part of China, and that therefore the differences that they have, between the mainland and Taiwan, different systems. Chinese recognize that. They have this policy of one country, two systems. Hong Kong, in spite of all the destabilizations that went on, is still a democratic government according to the traditions in Hong Kong. Taiwan also the same, and this has always been the policy. The issue was not that we want you to become, like us. The issue is that we are the national entity, and that you have your own system, we have ours. Foreign policy, military policy has to be determined by the national authorities, but otherwise you can go on governing yourself the way that you see fit, that is in the interest of Taiwanese people and the Chinese people. So that is not the issue. The mafia is not the issue. The issue is the issue of national sovereignty and territorial integrity. And this is something which has been determined by the Chinese are standing on a very firm stance when they are taking this. How it's going to go now is very hard to say. If we had a Franklin Roosevelt, if we had a Franklin Roosevelt in the White House, this wouldn't have happened. But if we had anybody that was even, moving in the direction of reason, as Lyndon LaRouche had indicated, and it said simply, hey, this has got to stop. We've got to act in a different way if we want to maintain peace in the region and peace in the world. Then you would see change coming on. There's nothing visible at this point, but there are all kinds of things going on because of the drama of this whole incident. For people, even who are defense thinkers, that realize that they don't want to go to war with the People's Republic of China, and therefore there must be an attempt. There must be people there, even within the administration, even within the Congress, who understand that there's a problem here, and hopefully they will come to the fore because of the intensity and the tension that now exists between the United States and China. And of course, our role is with the campaigns and with what Diane is doing there is to mobilize the citizenry to understand the nature of the situation and to get them to begin to liars under our politicians, and hopefully to elect the politicians who know how to do this job, as in the case of New York and the campaign of Diane, to try and get them in a position where they can actually begin calling the shots. I think this can happen. It's a rough road ahead. Things might get a little more tense before it changes, but I think we have to really orient towards getting an understanding of the real nature of this crisis to the American people, so that they can also begin to put the pressure on their politicians to do the right thing and to act in accordance with reason.
Well, thanks a lot, Bill. Carl, we're going to go to you, and as we go to you, besides, of course, the Pacific, whatever you can tell us about global NATO and the various antics there would also be appreciated. So go right ahead.
Well, what I'd like to do, Dennis, thank you, Dennis, first of all, for having me on. And what I'd like to do is a couple things I'd like to do. One is actually to get at this issue of truth that you were talking about so eloquently in the beginning with respect to what's going on in the Donbass region, and Donetsk in particular, because it's not even, it's not even allowed, according to the same narrative that you were describing, to talk about what's really happening on the ground in the Donbass. The corporate news media, for the most part, if it's anywhere near the region, is on the Ukrainian side. They're totally controlled by the Kiev regime and by their corporate media outlets and by the official narrative of the U.S. government, which the face of that narrative has been since over the last few months has particularly been this guy, John Kirby, who was the Pentagon spokesman. Now he's at the National Security Council at the White House. And if you read the transcripts of his briefings or watch his briefings, what you realize is that none of the media representatives present there will challenge the underlying assumptions of what he's saying, even though there's plenty of evidence to suggest that a lot of what's going on is the opposite of what they claim about what's happening to the Russian military campaign. And emblematic of the difficulties is what happens, how there is a number of independent journalists in Donetsk, in the Donbass region, who have been reporting through various outlets, YouTube, Telegram, channels like that, on what they see on the ground. And these people are under heavy attack from the narrative controllers that I just described. I'll mention one in particular, a gentleman by the name of Graham Phillips. He's a British citizen. He's been reporting from both Donetsk and Lugansk. And he is under attack from the British government itself. Jose, if you could run that video, I'd like to just show you a little bit of what he has to say about what's happening to him.
I wanted to touch on a big theme. War crimes. I've just come over the road, this beautiful Russian Orthodox church, and slightly rumbling, kind of Thomas Hardy-esque skies overhead, portentous. Let that be an omen to all of those who have wronged indeed. So, from the gods, many of you will recall back in April, I conducted an interview with Aidan Aslin, a British insert noun. We all know who and what Aidan Aslin is. The aftermath of that interview was such a shitstorm that it even made its way to the British Parliament, where certain PR-hungry politicians put it out there and others went along that I may be guilty of war crimes.
Robert Jenrick. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Aidan Aslin has served in the Ukrainian armed forces for 4 years. Last week, he was captured by the Russian army in Mariupol. Yesterday, a video emerged of my constituent handcuffed, physically injured, and being interviewed under duress for propaganda purposes. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that this is a flagrant breach of the Geneva Convention, that treating any prisoner of war in this manner is illegal, and that the interviewer, Graham Phillips, is in danger of prosecution for war crimes, and that any online platform, such as YouTube, which hosts propaganda videos of this kind, should take them down immediately?
There was no accusation, just an insinuation, but of course in the court of Twitter opinion, that is all it takes for you to be tried and convicted as a heinous war criminal. Well, actually, what happened was that Aidan Aslin asked for an interview with myself, specifically myself. I then conducted that interview. He's given countless interviews since to countless journalists and never uttered one word of any impropriety committed by myself, because there were none. It was all done in adherence with the proper standards and protocols of journalism. I am indeed.
So Graham Phillips goes on for about 10 more minutes on this, but basically what has happened to him is that the British government has sanctioned him. Now, the justification for the sanction basically is, and he said he reads this on the air, Graham Phillips is a video blogger who has produced and published media content that supports and promotes actions and policies which destabilize Ukraine and threaten the territorial integrity, sovereignty, or independence of Ukraine. So they drop as he points out, they drop the war crimes charge, but basically have said that he has to be sanctioned because he is in complete disagreement with British government policy. As people may know, Boris Johnson has been one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the regime in Kiev, both politically and with military assistance. I think the UK is second only to the US in the amount of military equipment that is actually shipped to Ukraine. But so what the sanctions do is they basically cut off all of his financial resources and made it virtually impossible for him to even keep a roof over his head or sustain his health through eating, making it difficult even to get his daily bread. So this is how the truth is treated in the UK. It's illegal basically. And I'll mention a couple of other independent journalists that are also in the Donbass. There's an American by the name of Patrick Lancaster, who has been reported directly from the front lines in both Donetsk and Luhansk. He has been subjected to death threats. His family has been subjected to death threats. By the way, Graham Phillips, after that parliamentary statement, has also been subjected to death threats. And the third journalist I'll mention is a young woman from Canada by the name of Eve Bartlett, who actually has a history going back to Gaza and Syria in 2016, where she reported directly from Aleppo on the crimes of the jihadis that were controlling Aleppo. And so the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation actually issued what amounts to a hit piece against her a couple of weeks ago, a really slanderous claims against her. And then I'll mention one other person who just came back to my mind just a few minutes ago, and that was another American by the name of Russell Bentley, who has been living in Donetsk since 2014 and was actually on the scene reporting there when the Ukrainian artillery shelling began to intensify starting on February 17th, which was actually a week before the Russian special military operation was begun. So getting on the ground reporting from what's happening in terms of the shelling, in terms of the crimes that are being committed by the Kiev regime's troops in the Donbass. This is a very difficult proposition. It is in effect illegal in the West for somebody to go ahead and do that, and so that leaves us with the false narratives coming from the American and British governments and from NATO and from other governments that are supporting this line, and this has, of course, a very serious effect on the conduct of policy because policy is made on completely false grounds, and this is very dangerous. And this really gets at the question that Lyndon LaRouche raised about countries pursuing policies that are against their own interests. So this is a very dangerous direction that things are going. Now, the second thing I would like to do is just to touch a little bit on the military problem that the U.S. has created for itself. It didn't begin on February 24th, or even in 2014, but goes back to the end of the Cold War with the rise of the sole superpower ideology, which actually is also known by other names, such as the Wolfowitz Doctrine in particular. Paul Wolfowitz, was an official in the Dick Cheney Defense Department in the early 1990s, when at the fall of the Soviet Union, they came to the view to express the view that now that the U.S. is the sole superpower in the world and would brook no challenge to that status. So this outlook was actually incorporated into drafts of the 1992 Defense Planning Guidance that were written under Cheney to try to make that official U.S. policy. Now, the White House that was George H.W. Bush was president at the time. The White House, Brent Scowcroft, I think, was the man responsible for this. He was the national security advisor. Basically rejected that kind of language, so that was not incorporated into the final version of the defense planning guidance. But it nonetheless became the outlook of policymaking in several successive presidential administrations since then, both Republican and Democratic. Now, one can say that Donald Trump tried to resist this to some degree when he was president, but his administration was overcome by the same ideological outlook nonetheless. What the result has been, and this, of course, was done in close collaboration, close coordination with the British government, Great Britain, because really this is British global policy. This is not a true American policy. This is British brains employing American muscle to run the world, basically. This goes back to, I mean, so this really made the United States the most aggressive, militarily the most aggressive nation on the planet. And you can look at the list of wars that the U.S. has conducted since 1989. The U.S. has attacked Panama, Iraq, Serbia, Afghanistan, Iraq again, Libya and Syria, and then, of course, waged drone strike campaigns in Somalia, Yemen, and Pakistan, and has had much lower profile military operations across much of Africa as well at the same time, and even to some degree in Asia and in the Philippines in particular, though most Americans are probably not even aware of some of these smaller campaigns. When you look at that record, you'd have to question whether or not U.S. accusations of Russia and China being militarily aggressive really make any sense at all. I mean, China hasn't actually attacked any country since the border war with Vietnam in 1979. And the Russian military campaigns since over the last 20 years have really been in response to provocations that were created by the U.S. and NATO, particularly in Georgia in 2008 and then Syria in 2015, where the Russians actually sabotaged the U.S. regime change campaign against the government of Bashar al-Assad. So the U.S. has spent the last 30 years spreading its military tentacles across the globe at the service of British politics, waging regime change wars and other operations. But the real targets, of course, have always been Russia and China, with the U.S. now, under the Biden administration, now directly confronting both countries. It should be noted that both Russia and China are nuclear-armed states. So this is much more dangerous than attacking Afghanistan or Iraq was, and those were bad enough. In Ukraine, the U.S. and along with its NATO allies have, especially the British, as I pointed out, have been pumping weapons into Ukraine with the declared aim of weakening Russia so that it can never threaten its neighbors again. This was Lloyd Austin, I think in the month of May, when he and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, both went to Kiev and then began this series of what are referred to basically as Ramstein meetings, where they bring a bunch of other countries together to decide what weapons to send to Ukraine. But despite all of this, there's been no lessening of the Russian military campaign. The hype about certain weapons, such as the HIMARS rocket launchers, basically covers up the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces not once have been able to seize the initiative on any part of the battlefield, especially in the Donbass, since the Russian military operation began. In fact, the main accomplishment of the Ukrainian armed forces has been the incessant shelling of the city of Donetsk and surrounding populated areas, killing and maiming civilians, who are in fact actually the main targets of this. At the same time, the U.S. and NATO combine has mainly shown that it has learned nothing from the debacle in Afghanistan. It has depleted its own stocks of weapons when it has limited capability at best of replenishing those stocks. For example, I'll give you an example of that. The U.S. has supplied a couple of thousand Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine, but they're not in production anymore except for very low-rate production for one unnamed customer, suspected to be Taiwan. And Lockheed Martin, which now owns the production rights for the Stinger, has said that it would take 2 to 3 years to rebuild that production capability. Were NATO to go to war on behalf of Ukraine, it would be facing a Russia that not only has demonstrated that it knows how to fight modern war, but also has much military capability that remains available. Russia has made clear repeatedly that direct NATO involvement in Ukraine brings with it the risk of nuclear war. Similarly, in the Western Pacific, I won't add too much to what Bill has already been through because his presentation was very thorough, but the U.S. has been repeatedly poking China in the eye with regard to the South China Sea and to Taiwan in particular. As Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman spokeswoman Hua Chunying said yesterday, China today is not the China of 120 years ago, a China that was humbled and exploited by European powers, especially the British Empire, for decades. The PLA exercises ongoing around Taiwan show Chinese confidence in their own war preparations and show that what could be around the corner should the Biden administration insist on de facto treating Taiwan as separate from the rest of China. Now, in 1996, as far as the U.S. military deployment in the Pacific, in 1996, the first time, which is when there was a previous Taiwan Straits crisis, a U.S. aircraft carrier sailed in the Taiwan Straits with a second one close by. But today, the U.S. Navy would not try to even come that close because China now has an immensely powerful missile armament, missile arsenal that not only includes anti-ship ballistic missiles, but also hypersonic missiles, which are nearly impossible to defend against. So the USS Ronald Reagan Aircraft Carrier Strike Group has been hanging around in the Philippine Sea, probably at least 1,000 kilometers, maybe more, away from Taiwan, just to stay out of the way of these Chinese missiles. So the U.S., vis-a-vis China, the U.S. simply does not have the military capability that it had in the 1990s, and therefore continuing a confrontation with China would be as dangerous as it would be with Russia. And to do both at the same time is really just totally insane. So I'd like to leave it at that. Dennis, turn it back over to you.
Okay, very good. So I've got several questions already, but Bill, just wanted you to clarify one thing for people as we get ready to go to the questions. Population of China is now about 1.4 billion, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What's the population of Taiwan?
Good question. Probably several hundred million. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at that.
Okay. And, well, some of the questions that are coming in, I'm sort of also abbreviating some of what they're asking. But could you say a little bit about the productive capabilities of Taiwan and what it represents as one of the major economies in the Pacific? What does it represent to the world economy? What does it mean for there to be a not just tensions, but actions taken, which might be of a sanctions nature? Several people are asking questions which are sort of related to this area. That's why I'm asking you to just do it this way.
To the issue of the economic role of Taiwan or of China?
Of Taiwan, what people are thinking is, well, if it's blockaded, for example, what does that mean? Suppose the Chinese were going to try to do the sorts of things that the United States has announced that it was trying to do around the economic blockade of Russia, for example. That's the character of the questions coming in.
Well, the discussion has been in the nature primarily of the semiconductors. The Taiwan is the major producer of semiconductors, which go into all kinds of electrical apparatuses, and the U.S. has had a policy of trying, on the one hand, trying to get the Taiwan Semiconductor Company to place its operations elsewhere than in Taiwan. But also they're trying to get control over the semiconductors that are being produced in Taiwan. And somebody made a comment, Wall Street has been very concerned about these operations. And I understand that one of the primary concerns was that if they blockaded Taiwan entirely and they couldn't get out these semiconductors, what happens to the world? I'm not sure what does happen to the world. But that's an issue that's extremely important for the world economy. In terms of the other things, I'm not exactly sure that Taiwan. They have an electronics industry, they've got a computer industry that's very well developed, but I don't think there's anything that's of a size that would affect significantly the world economy, except for these semiconductors. And this is, of course, the nature of the game in terms of the technological apartheid is don't let the Chinese get a hold of the Taiwan semiconductor industry. They do sell it. The Taiwan company sells to the United States. It sells to everything. It sells to China as well. But the idea was that the U.S. would want to try and prevent that from happening, prevent China from getting, the best of the best in terms of semiconductors. And as I understand it, this is becoming much more of a moot question. According to an article by David Sanger in the New York Times, who has his contacts with the intelligence community, China has already in Shenzhen and other places developed the capabilities for producing these high quality semiconductors so that they won't necessarily be dependent upon the import. But in terms of some of the crime, I'm sure it'll affect the computer industry to some extent if there were a total blockade. In terms of the produce and the fish and things like that, probably China is the biggest market for those products, but it would also have an effect, especially on the other countries in the Asia Pacific region. But it's unlikely that that's going to happen. I don't think that's really in the cards. What's in the cards, of course, is that what China wants is a change of policy on the part of the United States. But of course, what they're doing has an effect, and they're very conscious about this in terms of the Taiwan population, to get them to understand, because there is a Taiwan side to this, the things that are going on, that the DPP has been playing the game of using the United States and of using the Pelosi visit to strengthen their hand. And now the question is, as this thing blows up in their faces, Pelosi's not there to experience the boycott and the lack of ships coming in and the like, but the Taiwanese people are there. And the question is how will they react to this? Will they understand that this is not a kind of policy that's going to be beneficial for the Taiwanese economy? And I think that's also a major part of the game. Tsai Ing-wen will not be reelected until 2024, but there's a lot of political stuff going on, by the KMT and other parties to try and turn this thing around within Taiwan, of course, which would change the name of the game entirely. But in terms of their economic, strength, I don't think that such a blockade would have more significant effect on the world economy than what the United States has already done through the sanctions on Russia and the like.
So I'm going to now give you my questions. And by the way, according to Worldometer, the current population of Taiwan is 23,906,685 as of Friday, August 5th, 2022. Now, I don't know exactly how they know that that's the case. Somebody checked it. Is this like as of midnight, August 5th? Or we don't know. But okay. Who goes out and exactly monitors these things? It's sort of, anyway, that's what they said. So there are two questions, Bill, I'm going to give you. Then I'm going to go to Carl with a couple of questions for him. So they're both from the chat. One's from Sarah, and I don't have the other person who asked the question. But the first question is, and let me see if I can just get that. Okay, it says, I'm unclear about this, but is China, now this may have been because they were thinking this earlier. Are China's sanctions on Taiwan permanent for the foreseeable future? And if so, what would that mean for the global market? You've sort of just dealt with that. That relies on the chip manufacturing. The second question was something about quartz is easily accessible in the U.S. Could that be a reason for the flare-up? Are the question of sanctions? This, of course, everybody's worried about what happens to, U.S. trade. Is it a similar question to shutting down Nord Stream 2? So that's what people are asking. Any response to that?
Well, and the first part of the question, of course, is that I don't think these are going to be permanent. I think it's a clear message being sent to the Taiwanese with regard to the visit, and regard to extending an invitation to the visit, which they did, maybe not formally because they couldn't, they're not a country, but they did give a wink and a nod for Pelosi to come. That I think to the extent that there is a reaction on the part of the Taiwanese that they'll probably lift these sanctions. In fact, what they said in terms of the the fruits and vegetables and the fish was that they had a case, especially one of these. I can't remember the name of the mackerel. It's called like horse mackerel or something like that, which is very popular, I guess, both in China and in Taiwan. That there was COVID on one of the cases that they had, and they used this as a pretext that this is a health issue. And they didn't say it's an issue of that we won't against the Taiwanese people, but everybody knows that that's the case. But I think that can easily be turned around, to the extent that there are other signals coming out of Taiwan that they don't want to push this much further. It would also be the case, I'm sure, it'd alleviate things if the United States also moved in that direction as well. But one could probably, given the political situation, the different countries, this would probably be more likely that the Taiwanese would say something to get to restore the trade relations with China more quickly than the United States would. In terms of Nord Stream, I'm not sure how that is the case. Like I really don't know what the extent or the importance of the Taiwanese trade in the world. I really haven't looked at that at all. But I'm sure it is extensive. A lot of Chinese trade, of course, is with the mainland China, and you have a lot of the importers and exporters who also exist, who work on mainland China in terms of the relations back and forth, and they're also suffering on this thing. As a matter of fact, the other thing the Chinese did, that there were two organizations with Taiwanese officials operating in China of a political or social nature that were closed down because the Chinese said that they're promoting this Taiwanese independence. So that's also another thing. But I don't think it's as extensive. I mean, you don't have the energy thing. The closing the Nord Stream 1. I mean, this affects a lot of people, right? I mean, it affects a chunk of all of Europe, as a matter of fact. And but I don't think you'd have the same kind of effect by any major Taiwanese export, even in the Asia Pacific region. And the only thing that comes to my mind in terms of what Taiwan is unique in are these semiconductors and possibly portions of the electronics industry. But other than that, I don't think it's going to have world-shaking effects. If it continues, like I say, I think these are all temporary and are dependent on what the United States does.
Carl, here's a question for you. Your presentation has exposed how fascist European governments of the world actually are. Since it's becoming dangerous to ask questions about the official narrative and the quote Great Reset, how much longer can they continue to operate this way? It seems like every day that they do something, more and more comes to expose themselves and their real intentions. Will they end up blowing the world up before they concede power? And if so, are we doing all we can to intervene before that happens? That's the question, Carl.
Okay, well, it's always dangerous to be asked to make a prediction. But clearly, what the feature of this all is that the gap between what's actually happening and the narrative keeps growing. And at a certain point, and I can't tell you when that point will be, but at a certain point, obviously something's going to snap. And we hope for, and what we'll fight for, is that the snap means it's something like the campaign now against Chuck Schumer in New York, that the truth will embarrass him to the point where he'll do something stupid and expose himself for the fascist that he really is. That's what Diane's campaign is aiming at, and Scott Ritter brought up some very good points in his recent articles on the blacklist, the Ukrainian blacklist, that in fact that Schumer is supporting and a regime in another country which is actually targeting American citizens, and they're using American taxpayer dollars provided by legislation that Schumer supported to do it. So at a certain point, the truth will out, as the saying goes. How that will happen, I can't predict. But that would be a lot better for it to happen that way than if we actually go to the point of a breakdown that results in a nuclear war, which is what we all have to be fighting to prevent from happening. And my cat would like to contribute to that fight as well. So, I mean, that's the way I would answer that question.
Some of the cats of our organization are more advanced than the cats that were depicted in Orwell's Animal Farm. I'll put it like that. Our cats actually believe in fighting. All right, Bill, this is a question for you. It's often said that the Chinese have a history that spans over 5,000 years. But how much of that history has any effect on the events of today? Couldn't it be argued that it is only the events of the last 120 years that have shaped modern-day China into the superpower it is today?
I would really object to that in one sense. Actually, 1,000 years is expanding now. It's probably a lot more than that. I mean, the Chinese have discovered in a lot of the archaeological work that they're doing that there are entire civilizations that in the center of the Yangtze Valley and elsewhere, especially this one Sanxing Ding, I think it is, where they found all these ancient remnants there, which go back more than 5,000 years. So I think it's even more than that. But it does have an effect because it affects the people. Look, culture is a very it's a very fixed thing. It's something that stays with you. It doesn't just disappear with the changing times. It exists in the language. It exists in in the phrases, the way people think, the way people do things. And China was a very poor country for 100 years. They were under the boot of the British and the Americans and others. When they did the G7, when the G7 issued the statement, the Chinese Foreign Ministry made a comparison to the 8-power declaration in 1860, in which these 8 colonial countries moved into Beijing ostensibly because of the killing of I think it was killing of a missionary or something. And they used it as a pretext to move into what was then the Summer Palace and destroy it. Of course, that area still exists as a destroyed area. And you can go to what is called the Old Summer Palace. They built a new one after that to see the ruins that were there. And that's a part of the culture, but also even the older things. I mean, and these things exist, and they kind of the fabric of thought of the Chinese people. And they met the modern age with too much fear, in one sense. And so that they turned to isolation. They felt these people who are coming in here in 1700s are an alien nation, which means us good. And therefore, we will shut ourselves off to everything they have to offer. But of course, what was also coming in with these colonial, this so-called colonial globalization beginning, was also the years of the Renaissance, which were far more advanced than the advanced scientific knowledge that existed in China at that time, and would have been a wonderful compliment had they said, "Okay, don't want your boot on our necks, but we'll take your technology and we'll study it and we'll do that." And they didn't do that. That was the biggest mistake, which allowed these countries to come in and just run hog wild and running over them into really a subject drugged down population, right? Which the British did, which was what the British always did. There is no good in that British Empire. There's no upside to that. And if you read the documents that have been issued nowadays, including this Legacy of Violence book, you will see that this was the evil empire and is the evil empire to this day. And our, United States trying to imitate it, is the worst thing that could happen. Is ripping up the Constitution and everything that the founding fathers stood for, and that's the problem that we're facing today. But it was because of that culture that existed, even in the poor sections of the country, right? The language and also the written language, which unites the Chinese people more than anything else. They have speaking different languages in many respects in different parts of the country. But that written language, which has existed for thousands of years, has united them and provides the basis for the mode of thinking, for their culture, for their music, for all of that. And it's because they had that basis at the point in time where they decided, after this whole period of this crazy cultural revolution, that we will adopt the technology of the United States to be that basis, culturally, they could move very, very quickly. I mean, they had a different situation because they were not ensconced in the, New York, London banking system. And they had this independence of being able to leapfrog from their still low wage manufacturers to something else. But they had also something else that often enough was lacking, in other developing countries. They had this tremendous culture. And I think because of that really gave them a boost forward, unlike anything else. So no, it does make a difference. I mean, the fact that they have that has formed the Chinese people today, it is a conscious culture. They are very proud of it, and they are preserving it, and they are doing everything to discover more and more. And that's important for the history of man, right? Because it's our history too. I mean, 6,000, 7,000 years ago, right? How many, that's us too. That was our prehistory. And so what doing is extremely important. And it plays a definite role in China today. And when they say we've always been talking about harmony, we aren't warlike, we aren't conquering other people, and they never did. I mean, they really never did. I mean, you had these treasure ships that went around all over the world long before Columbus, much better than what Columbus had in 1400s, right? But they didn't go and take over control of, Malaysia or India or Africa, where they also went to Africa, but they with them, right? And that's because the culture was much different. Right. And that makes all the difference in the world. And I think it would be beneficial for the world, as the Chinese say, that they have an idea of how to do things that could be beneficial for many other people too. So having a say in world politics, on the basis of that culture, I think is very important.
What we're going to do is we have a question which is for both Carl and for Bill. But to do it, I want to introduce Lynn, and just before I say this, let me just point out to people that in China there are some 302 languages spoken, and English is not any in the top 3 or 4. And in India there are 121 languages spoken, and you wouldn't recognize the names of most of them, and that these are nations. And each one of them is 4 times the size of the United States in population. So it's important to realize where we talk about this idea of the last 120 years is important. This is just for everybody. What'll be happening next week, actually, on this in this location, we'll be talking about the 75th anniversary of Indian independence from the British. And that may give people a kind of an opportunity to begin to think about how to think about what we are actually discussing. Luckily for us, Lyndon LaRouche wrote so many different documents, gave so many different talks, and then many people who collaborated with him did so much work that there is a wealth of capability that we bring to answering questions like this. And we are going to ask that everybody listening, everybody watching, will help or assist, especially in making this moment that the Ukrainian characters have screwed up and put us into the center of things, a moment where people can actually get to know the work that Lyndon LaRouche did, the work that the Schiller Institute has done, so that they might be able to pose questions about the real world from the standpoint of the real world. That's not to say that you shouldn't have asked the questions or anything like that. All questions should be asked. But the question for you and for us is to elevate the platform from which we are discussing these matters. Now that leads me to the next question. And to answer it in part, we're going to bring in a video of Lyndon LaRouche. So the question was, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced yesterday morning that in response to Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, China would cancel a number of military talks and other cooperation discussions. Bill went through that extensively. LaRouche often discussed the failures of U.S. foreign policy in regard to Asia, and how it was common that states often are devoutly committed to policies contrary to their own best interests. How can the United States realize its best interests in regard to cooperation with other nations and to its own development and welfare? And I think that's a very specific question actually to right now, because when we get off this today, this discussion, much of what will be the work of the people on the discussion, it will be to try to find a way to make that policy available. So we're going to play an excerpt from Lyndon LaRouche. I think this is January of 1988, if I'm not mistaken. So it is the beginning of the year of 1988. The last one we did was the end of that year. And this is, I believe, from Andover, Massachusetts, and a conference which was called for a new Bretton Woods policy.
Now, there is very little that you couldn't fix in the United States if you started from an increase of total output of about 35% per capita. There is no budget that couldn't be balanced. And so, now, to take this and put this in the context of international economic and monetary reform. The Bretton Woods system and its zombie relic, its Dracula relic, called the floating exchange rate system. That is, they kill the floating rate, they kill the old Bretton Woods system, and they brought it back as a walking corpse which walks at night and sucks the bloods of nations. The floating exchange rate system. That thing just has to be scrapped. It's a very simple thing to scrap it. It's a creation of treaty agreements of governments. If governments abrogate those treaty agreements or alter them, it simply ceases to exist. The IMF can sit there, it can vibrate, it can oscillate, but it just sits there. Same with the World Bank. That the monetary system has to be based on the authority of sovereign governments. It is effectively a treaty organization among sovereign governments and has no legitimate authority except as a treaty organization of sovereign governments as partners. Therefore, what we simply do is we take the old monetary system, put it to one side, put it in the closet, and open the closet to horrify children on Halloween. We sort it out later. The question is, how do we generate growth? Well, the first thing that has to happen is, as president, I would have to have most of the so-called third world leaders as in the capacity of preferably of either presidents or prime ministers or foreign ministers or some combination of both. We'd have to meet and settle immediately the question of restructuring and reorganization of debt of these nations as far as involved the United States. Well, if the United States government signs a memorandum of agreement to such effect, simply a signature on a memorandum of agreement is effectively a treaty with the president and issues a presidential directive of emergency and then pass it as a pledge down to Congress to be treated as a treaty and make the treaty law. But the president can do a great number of things under emergency conditions in this form. Now, once the United States government, once the President of the United States has entered into such an agreement with a group of developing nations on restructuring and reorganization of their external debt, an expansion of their import capacity and conditions of new volumes of loans for economic development, well, the rest of the world just has to go along with it. And thus we would have, in effect, the basis for a new monetary system simply by these kinds of agreements. What would make it a monetary system would be the agreement of the other countries, the Western European countries and others, to agree to create credit, not for money loans. I don't think that lending money does any good. It just leads to usury. What should be lent are strictly lines of credit. Short-term, medium-term, long-term credit. There's no sense in the United States government or any banks running around giving countries money. It doesn't do any good and usually does a great deal of harm. The money rarely, somehow disappears in the Swiss banks on the way into the development project, in most cases. Not into the country. Give these countries lines of credit for their infrastructure, agricultural, and industrial development projects, including such things as health programs and educational systems under infrastructure. Supply them what they need. Give them the means they require to employ vast armies of unemployed labor or misemployed labor. That in general, in my opinion, from looking at many developing projects in developing sectors, that most developing countries could undertake most large-scale development projects using 80% domestic resources. That what they require from foreign countries is essentially certain crucial included elements of the project, which amount to about anywhere from 5% to 20% of the total package. The trick is to enable countries to survive on their own resources, to give them the ability to mobilize their labor, to give them the ability to lay the basis for their own development as sovereign states. And we can do that. It's no mystery for those of us who are economists, particularly physical economists, and I suppose I can do a pretty good job right here if we want to take the time to do it, to run off a list of major infrastructural development projects which would transform this planet. These infrastructural projects would create the domestic markets in the countries they affected for the growth and development of agriculture and industry. It would mean new industries. It would mean increase in food supplies. Would come automatically. Railroad projects. We have now better railroads. We have the magnetic levitation trains, and we have the power to run them, which are cheaper, better, cheaper to maintain, cheaper to build, which can run at speeds of 300 to 400 miles an hour. You have to run them that speed. Railroads, water management projects, both for transportation and for better utilization of water for general purposes in agriculture and control of the environment. And above all, production of power. We know there's no escape from power production, and despite some people's sensibility, there's no escape from nuclear power production. There is no alternative. And look at the deforestation of Africa and India, and you see the fact. Or look at India, which, how does it power its economy? It takes coal, runs it from the mines of the north, down to the cities of India, and the movement of tons of coal by freight car is destroying the Indian railway system. Without nuclear energy, India is doomed. It's not a matter of choice. There is no alternative. Yes, there's great hydroelectric potential, but hydroelectric projects properly managed give you very little net energy. Because if you manage them properly, you use as much energy to maintain the system properly as you do as you get from it. Or if you get power from it, you cannot control at will the time you get the power from it. You have only certain parts of the year and certain conditions under which you get a significant net power production. We don't have fusion power yet. We should have, but we don't. So therefore, and in this area, you can measure this. You can measure it with all the figures with the history, economic history of mankind. The level of productivity and income of a population is a function of the density of usable energy supplied per person and per square kilometer. The difference between India and a developing country, or other developing countries, Japan, North America, Europe today, is infrastructure, measured in power. There is no development without infrastructure. It's impossible. It's a physical impossibility. Someone says we're going to develop our industries and our agriculture rather than infrastructure. They don't understand economics. It's impossible. You can measure this in calories. Measure this in kilowatts. The number of kilowatts of infrastructure consumption of energy per person and per square kilometer determines absolutely the upper limits of economic development in terms of per capita productivity and consumption. If you don't have that development, you are doomed to a level of development which coincides with the amount of energy per capita per square kilometer you have. So in those terms, water projects, some reforestation projects, transportation projects, including rail, particularly in water management, power, and other infrastructures such as health systems, school systems, the development of new kinds of cities which are cheaper to maintain, more durable, these kinds of projects. This is what the world needs. It really doesn't need to think about much else.
All right, so what we've just heard, of course, is the outline for what an actual new Bretton Woods system would do and how it would function. Of course, there's some things that would be different. That was recorded 34 years ago. I'd like to have everybody just know. But I think that gives a kind of basis for what I'd like to pose to you, Bill, and also to Carl. It was sort of coming to the end. We're not ending per se, but we're sort of approaching it. And Bill, I'm going to start with you as you think of how you want to respond to this. But like you, in your course of your response, to say a little bit to people about the memorandum that on February 4th of this year, Russia and China had issued concerning what would be their joint working arrangement or relationship thereafter on questions of economic development and progress, if that happens to be something that can be fit in your own observations on this.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think what you see is that part of this idea that at the time Lynn was speaking was really an idea which was not being realized in most parts of the world, has now been, since 2013, has now been the basic program of the People's Republic of China, not only with regard to their own nation, but also with regard to all nations of the world, particularly the developing sector. Some of this, of course, probably had been the result of some of the activity that Lynn had done, never having gone to China, but have spoken numerous times, virtually hundreds of times, before audiences and reporters and others, to get this message out that this was not not noticed in China, that they were aware of this, but they also had their own 5,000 years of culture, and so there are thinkers there who are not totally out in the blue, who adopted much of this. And of course, what came together, as we know, in the Belt and Road Initiative was this, the connection between thinking in this direction on the Chinese side and the program of the LaRouches, as was expressed in the Productive Triangle and the New Silk Road. And that has become a reality. So it's, at this point, it's not a description of the future. It's a description of the present, at least in part. And many of those things that are going on in Africa and in Latin America as a result, and in Southeast Asia as a result of the BRI, is totally consistent, in sync with what Lynn has been calling for. And had it been the case in the beginning, when the United States was looking at this Belt and Road Initiative, that the U.S. could easily have joined that and would have built, as was the intention and the discussion at the time, some of these high-speed rails that had been taken even further by the Chinese to try and repair the infrastructure of the United States. And there were many, Chinese firms. The U.S. was not in favor of Chinese owning all this stuff, but they were in favor of the collaboration and could have been much more extensive with the Chinese on this. And you would have had the same kind of development also within the United States, much more quickly, of course, because of the condition that you have had in these other countries that have been affected by the BRI. But we decided to say no. We decided to say no because of geopolitical reasons. Because by saying yes, that means that we have to treat China as an equal in this respect, and not as a nation, as we do with most of the nations of the world. And that was obviously unacceptable. And of course, the Russian and Chinese cooperation on this is becoming very important. The Russians, in fact, do have a very living concept, a living tradition of LaRouche. He had been there because major economists like Glaziev, who are advisors today, are really following the policy of LaRouche. So that you have in this constellation, which probably will get closer now, and it won't, people are talking about a Russia-China alliance, and the U.S. is looking, are the Chinese going to sell, Russia weapons to use in Ukraine? I wouldn't look at things in that regard, but there is this relationship, which is a firm, fast, and long-term relationship in terms of the economics, in terms of also the political ideas that the world no longer can be determined by a unilateral power, but that there must be this consort of nations to discuss, as Lynn was talking about, in terms of in implementing that policy, which would determine the course of world history. And this, of course, is what they would want to do. Now, it's difficult now because the U.S. has decided we're going to, divide the world into two parts now, and we're going to be calling the shots, and we're going to isolate all the others. But the fact of what's going on, what happened now after the Pelosi visit, will have an effect on all of this, because now you're going to have all these countries. In fact, the Chinese, in 1971, it was not the U.S. that said yes, China should be a part of the United Nations. It was all these other 100 and so, how many countries it was at that time, largely developing countries, that said we've got to change this policy, and the policy was changed. And now you have them also coming to the support of this one China policy in opposition to the United States and the small group of countries. And it's smaller than you think. I mean, even the G7 now is, not a complete, and complete cooperation on this thing. And the countries of Asia, which have not, even the Korean. Remember, the Korean prime minister wouldn't meet with a Korean president, new Korean president, who's a conservative, who wants a good relationship with the U.S., would not meet with Pelosi, because that was a bridge too far for him as well. So you're having countries coming together out of this crisis, a very serious and dangerous crisis, coming together in support not only of China, but of the policy that they have implemented with this Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, Russia is an integral part of this because of the relationship it has with China. So I think it's my comment on this would be that we're in an ideal situation now, more than in 1988 when Lynn gave that speech, to implement this policy, in spite of the fact that things are much tenser than I think when they were in 1988. Although it was quite as bad as now. But because you have the mobilization of the world around this kind of policy, and our basic problem is that this small group of countries that will ally with this unilateralist program have got to be changed, and that's of course that's really our role, because we are a force here, and China can't do it, Russia can't do it, but we can, and also what we mobilize within Europe, that can shift the situation around. But the momentum is in this direction. Also, ironically, because of the Pelosi visit, that countries are now taking a stand that this is the direction we want to go, and not in that direction, not the direction of war and collapse and crisis and inflation. Right. So I think it's one can be optimistic about that.
Your thoughts?
I mean, what I've been looking at lately, this is sort of outside of my usual lane, but where does this exist in American history? It exists particularly with Franklin Roosevelt, right? With his original intention of the New Bretton Woods, which flowed from his good neighbor policy towards Latin America, which was basically a prosper thy neighbor policy. That is, it is to our benefit to have neighbors who are prosperous. This is the opposite of like the outlook of Henry Kissinger, who famously said, I think this was in the early 1980s, that we would have not tolerated a new Japan south of our border. In other words, we would keep Mexico backwards and poor, which I think has been done great damage to the United States in the drug trafficking and other problems that flow out of Mexico into the U.S., which could have been at least severely attenuated if Mexico were prosperous. So that was the original intention of Franklin Roosevelt. That comes out of the true American tradition, which has been lost, unfortunately, which we need to recover, which continue to exist in the policies and outlook of Lyndon LaRouche. So, I mean, I think that's really all the best thing I can add to it.
Okay. Just before we conclude, just wanted to get both of your thoughts on what this Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation breakthrough may augur, by which I mean that the fact that they made such a big deal about us and put us at the head of this list of 70 plus persons, including John Mearsheimer, Senator Rand Paul, former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, Glenn Greenwald, all these other characters. Most of them had not spoken at our conferences, but there were 30 people, including Ray McGovern and others that had. And now what is beginning to happen is a sort of ricocheting around the world in different forms, whether that be in India, whether that be in Denmark, where a parliamentarian has made an official inquiry, and the foreign minister of that nation will have to respond to that in some way as to why the government of Denmark, which purports to be supporting democracy, would be supporting a government that's in fact suppressing, banning political parties, calling journalists information terrorists, and otherwise expressing its intention to take actions, including physical actions, to stop any form of dissent whatsoever. So, given both of your long association with Lyndon LaRouche personally, but also the Schiller Institute, the various organizations and institutions, what do you see sort of in the aftermath of that development, especially when we look at the way in which the present circumstance is so sort of chaotically unresolved on the world scene? How do you think our own work, or for that matter, the work of the people who are opposing us, may place us in a position to both be heard and to offer some sort of alternative? I'll start with you first, Bill.
Well, I think they let the cat out of the bag. The British let the cat out of the bag in this operation. This was really kind of a bridge too far. because what they're saying, and remember, it's the British, and Carl will tell you, all these statements that are coming out about Ukrainian military options and their view, it's coming out of the British intelligence, which is really on the ground. I mean, it's American. Again, it is American, in this case, American money and British on the ground operations. That they're saying that these are the people that we fear the most. And all the people in the world who either know or will come to understand the real nature of this fascist regime, which was put into place by British intelligence over a long period of time, as they begin to see the real nature of this beast, they will also see that, that we are the ones that are leading the fight against it. All right. And so in one sense, they gave away their hand. They can no longer ignore us, which they've been trying to do, right? Pretend it doesn't exist. We hit them on a sensitive point, and they have reacted. They have said, yes, we have been hit, and it's got to stop. There's a danger there, of course, because it is also like a death threat here, and what's going on, what Scott Ritter also mentioned on this thing, this has to be taken seriously. But I think it has been the recognition on the part of the British Empire that we are the main enemy of these operations that are ongoing. And I think that's going to be very, very beneficial for Diane's campaign, because we are active. I mean, this is the center of our activity, as well as the other campaigns, and that this will be very beneficial in pointing out to people who are, not uninformed but not stupid, that you're going to in terms of trying to, win this election, how things really lie, and what, who's really telling the truth and who's not. So I think it will have a beneficial effect throughout the world, because the British have said these guys are the enemy. They want to destroy us, and we would like to destroy them.
Carl?
I would just add to that, there's actually a historical precedent, Dennis, and you may remember this. Lyndon LaRouche and Helga were both slandered heavily by the Soviets in the 1980s after Reagan adopted Lynn's SDI policy. The slanders were, of course, circulated within the Soviet Union, but also outside. And what we found after the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed was a lot of intellectuals in Russia looked at these slanders and said, instead of reacting negatively, saying, we have to stay away from this, they actually said, and we encountered this, we need to learn more about who these people are and what they're actually doing. So it actually, the slanders actually drew attention to what Lynn and Helga were doing in those years. And that facilitated, of course, the entry of Lynn's ideas into Russia and the effect that they would later have and are still having now, as you already described with Sergei Glatzev. So the precedent tells us what will happen, and I think that's what will happen.
Yeah, I think that's also true. Okay, so Bill Jones, Carl Osgood, I want to thank you both for being with us today. I want to thank everybody that has been participating in today's webcast. Also, let's put up again the Schiller Institute statement, which we're asking that people both sign and circulate, which is in response to this Ukrainian operation, the call for an investigation of the Ukrainian Center for the Countering Disinformation hit list. You see it there. You can get in touch with us and do that. And I think that the final thing I'd just like to indicate is that Lyndon LaRouche's role in this circumstance is a little bit like Hamlet's father's ghost at the beginning of the play. You're actually already told at the beginning of the play what the subject of the play is, which is saving Denmark. And then what happens is that you sit for 5 acts, and at the end of the play, the opposing armies come in and simply walk in and take over Denmark because everyone is dead. Now, people like to talk about Hamlet and what was wrong with Hamlet, but actually there was something rotten in Denmark. And the problem involved is that the ghost of Lyndon LaRouche, as we just saw portrayed particularly in his meticulous and detailed outline for what to do then in January of 1988, is the necessary conscience, if you want to put it that way. Geist might be another way of thinking about it. Thought mass or thought object that we're going to try to present to people over the course of the next 4 weeks. In fact, 4 weeks from now, I believe that'll be September 10th and 11th, there will be a Schiller Institute conference. And during that conference, one of the things we will be doing is to be premiering the work we've been doing now for 2 or 3 years almost, through the LaRouche Legacy Fund, to assemble various, both of the writings, video presentations, and other works of Lyndon LaRouche. And so that's something that we can look forward to you helping us disseminate throughout the world. Because as people begin to see what both he did and what the organizations associated with him did, it will become clearer why he was silenced to such a degree that very few people in the United States have ever read anything by him or have any idea of how clear and precise his solutions for the problems that confront the United States today were then, as his Earth's Next 50 Years, which is another book he wrote, outlines very clearly what the United States ought to be doing in concert with Russia, China, and India today. And so we invite you to go on the journey of working with us over the next 4 weeks to make this conception of a new security architecture based on economic development, and even potentially a new Bretton Woods, which of course becomes very problematic to propose when you have, the kind of, monkeypox called Nancy Pelosi, sort of showing up, sort of unwelcome on the doorstep of China. It becomes very difficult. How do those nations possibly put forward a proposal like that? That can only be done by Americans. So it's got to be done by Americans who are repudiating the posture of the United States, find ways to do that, whether that be in the electoral arena or merely by speaking out, but have to become extremely public and extremely well known in this country in order that in other countries, persons there that wish to pursue that same avenue of resolution of these problems can credibly say, look, there is a force in the United States. You can see them. And here's what they are doing to try to rectify this circumstance. And so it's very important that the dialogue process that we have tried to pursue and has been pursued, particularly over the last couple of years, that people have been drawn into through this location, this platform, and other platforms, be in this period radically accelerated. Time is of the essence, and that is the best way, I think, to be true to the legacy of Benjamin Franklin and Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, I want to wish you good afternoon and good organizing.